Good morning, everyone. It's the top of the hour here, 11 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. I think a few more people will be joining us in the next minutes coming through the door. My name is John Doyen. I'm the Executive Vice President with INSA, and we're really pleased that everyone can join us here today for the session called Homeland Defense Threats, Coordination, and Readiness. A few housekeeping notes. First, we will be doing questions via question card. So there should be some of these on your seats. If you have a question, please write it out legibly and concisely, and we'll have some folks going around collecting the questions during the session. And then also I want to go ahead and extend a big thank you to the sponsor for the session this morning. That is 10X National Security. So thanks to them for their generous support. Otherwise, these types of sessions just aren't possible. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. We have a great panel for you all today, starting with our moderator, Greg Myre, who's the National Security Correspondent for NPR. We also have Ron Ocker, the Assistant Commissioner, Office of Intelligence, Custom and Border Protection. Next to him is Matt Tyson, the Acting Deputy Undersecretary at the Office of Intelligence and Analysis over at Department of Homeland Security. And then we also have Jost, who's the Director of Critical Infrastructure, High Consequence Mission with Parsons Corporation. So over to you, Greg, and the team, and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, John. Really appreciate it. Got a great group who's going to look at these issues from lots of different angles here. Just to get it going, kind of a lightning round, I want to hear from all of you. What's the most important security threat or concern that you have? Ron, you want to start us off?
So right now we've got really probably three primary focuses. So Customs and Border Protection. Our whole mission is to secure the border and prevent bad people and bad things from coming into the country. And right now, one of the number one threats to our nation coming across the border are synthetics, and that is fentanyl being the primary synthetic that we're looking at. When you look at the number of overdose deaths in the United States, that is nearly 100,000 people a year, and 70,000 of those are related to fentanyl. We're trying to understand and then disrupt the flow of fentanyl. Along with the flow of fentanyl, there's methamphetamine, and then we see cocaine on the rise as well. So preventing the flow of narcotics and synthetics specifically into the United States through our border is a primary mission area for us, along with understanding how the enemy, when it comes to terrorist organizations, are attempting to infiltrate the border as well. And how do we prevent those terrorists then from coming into our country and doing harm to the American people? And then finally, that third category would be the Foreign Intelligence Service threat. The country is experiencing fairly high rates of intellectual property theft by foreign intelligence services in order to advance other countries' agendas through illegal means. So those are the three primary areas that we're looking at right now. And then also, the big mission also is the facilitation of fair trade and travel throughout. But those are the primary threats right now. And as we go on through the discussion, we'll talk about how we formed a Southern Border Intelligence Center and how we're addressing those threats through a whole of government effort.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, just to build on that, and I would not disagree at all with my DHS colleague Ron here on those threats. I would say in the sort of the mid to longer term, but something that we're trying to stay out in front of now is also the looming threat of adversary cooperation. Especially among nation-state adversaries. That is something that we are looking at very deeply now in an attempt to stay out in front of that. And in particular, that's because it can manifest in so many different ways. It's the multifaceted, specific threats that can be brought to bear, sometimes even in a combined way by these nation-state adversaries alone. That is troubling. When you partner them together, or the prospect of combining them together among nation-state adversaries, it becomes a truly significant and historic threat that we're trying to stay out in front of today.
Great. Joe?
Greg, I'd say the thing that I'm most concerned with is nation-state actors' cyber sabotage against U.S. critical infrastructure, especially in the run-up to war. and open conflict, and specifically how we can get private sector owners of that critical infrastructure working with the government better to mitigate that.
Okay, great. And hold that thought. We'll talk about cyber intrusions versus cyber sabotage a little later. Ron, I looked up some numbers, so we're going to have the math portion of our program and get that out of the way right at the beginning. At the end of 2023, less than 2 years ago, the border protection was having about 250,000 250,000 encounters per month. That number started coming down last year, fell below 100,000, and then this year it's continued to drop rather dramatically, been fewer than 10,000 per month. The latest figure available was July, 4,600 encounters on the southern border. That is a 98% decrease in encounters on the southern border in less than 2 years. Please discuss.
Okay, yeah, so that is primarily the result of a policy. After January 20th, the United States policy towards illegal immigration dramatically changed. And that primary change was that you were not going to be admitted into the United States while you were making an asylum claim. And the power of social media then reverberated that message all the way throughout the world. And just to show you what I think is one of the most dramatic numbers is that we had a barometer that we used, and that is the Darien Gap. And the Darien Gap is a jungle region between Panama and Colombia. And what we were doing was looking at the weekly flow of migrants through that, because the primary land route to the U.S. border would start down in the Darien Gap and then move up through Central America, Tapachula, Mexico, and then up to our border. And then based off ethnicity, they would go to different areas along the border. So at the height of those numbers that you just described, we were looking at 10,000 people a week transiting through the Darien Gap. And that Darien Gap, that jungle region, is an incredibly treacherous and dangerous area. And people were in very desperate conditions that were driving them through there. What we are seeing now is a drop from 10,000 a week to about 7 people a month coming through there. And the reason being is they know that they're not going to be able to make a legal entry into the United States, nor will a claim be looked at and adjudicated while inside the United States. And so that has many, many repercussions, one of which is the numbers that you just described, Greg. And then the other big area that hit are the drug trafficking organizations. So drug trafficking organizations are really diversified international corporations. And one of their major revenue streams for a long time had been human smuggling. So a drug trafficking organization, or we should really change that to a transnational criminal organization, was having billions of dollars in revenue generated through human smuggling. And human smuggling is voluntary movement up to the border. So if I wanted to come into the United States and I wanted to do it through illegal means, I would pay Greg as a member of a transnational criminal organization to facilitate my travel through. Human trafficking is when the individuals are involuntarily moved from one location to another for some sort of nefarious and horrible purpose. And so when the U.S. policy changed on our U.S. border, it took away billions of dollars in revenue stream for the transnational criminal organizations that are also drug trafficking organizations. And now they are seeking ways in which to make up for that lost revenue. And so they're diversifying themselves even more. And what we're looking at now is how do we create more chaos and inflict a higher cost on those organizations to bring drugs into the United States. And later, Greg, we can talk about what we've developed, what we call right now a Plaza Spike campaign, in which we're trying to cause the maximum amount of disruption at the plaza level And plazas, there are 27 geographic regions along the US-Mexico border, and they're called plazas. And these plazas are defined by either natural terrain or by man-made features such as railroads or rivers, not man-made, but natural features, rivers and mountains and things. And all of these plazas are that last point of departure from Mexico into the United States, and where they move either money, drugs, people, or weapons back and forth. And so we can talk about that. But primarily, to answer your question, policy change, social media, messaging through people who were trying to make that journey, and that results in those dramatic number changes.
Lot to pull on there, and we will. Matt, we have seen some dramatic and terrible incidents recently. The killing of Charlie Kirk, the Minnesota lawmaker Melissa Hortman, who was killed along with her husband, and two other people were shot in Minnesota. 2 attempts on the life of Donald Trump last year when he was a candidate. It seems, based on what we know now, these were individuals. These were not groups. There's no sign of a conspiracy here. How do you and your organization find these people in advance? Are these going to be things that we cannot stop, or are there ways to stop them?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Obviously, these are horrible tragedies that have occurred, and unfortunately, the threat of attacks from lone offenders, as we refer to them, Greg, it's not a new problem. So the benefit to that is it has given us years to build out layers of resilience. Unfortunately, there are numbers of them out there, and it's a constant challenge. I think you call attention to one key aspect, and that is trying to proactively deal with them. First and foremost, my office, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, our primary function is to deliver solutions from a federal level that helps empower and enable state and local law enforcement and other folks on the front lines within communities to be able to deal with this threat as it evolves over time. I mean, in many instances it does, and including in the examples you highlighted, it comes down to local community sorts of issues. They are localized and they have to be dealt with at that level. So that's our primary function, is to help facilitate that. The key way we go about doing that is through enhanced, timely, and accurate and tailored exchange or flow of information and intelligence. There's only a relatively small number of people, in and across law enforcement structures and national security systems throughout the United States who actually have clearances. So we are purpose-driven to deliver unclassified, or what we refer to as for official use only, which is still pretty widely disseminable among risk managers out, throughout the homeland, getting those insights in a way that is actionable for them and in as timely a way as possible when we identify those threats. Certainly since the birth of the Department of Homeland Security back in 2002, that has been our primary function, and is something we take great pride in continuing to build out today, whether it's dealing with threats from bad actors who come across the border that Ron spoke of, or the lone actors, the lone offenders and attackers that you alluded to as well, Greg.
Right. And Joe, I want to pick up sort of a related point there, where Matt's talking about working with state and local governments that may have limited resources or limited experience in trying to find individuals or bad actors. You're working for a private company, Parsons, also working with the private sector in trying to detect threats and critical infrastructure. Could you talk about drawing on your expertise and the expertise of Parsons and dealing with companies that may know how to deal with some sort of localized rodent problem, but not necessarily Chinese hackers?
Right. So as a quick aside, Parsons is about a 70-year-old company that does construction, like moving yellow iron and building airports and things, but also cyber activities for the U.S. government. And so it's a unique perspective to look at these things. And when we reach out to the private sector, we look at it from a profit and loss perspective. As most critical infrastructure in the United States overwhelmingly is owned by a private entity, that's the way they look at cybersecurity. So they look at a possible sabotage attack as a loss center for them. How do they minimize cost in dealing with those things? So I think that one of the primary things that the government can continue to do to work with the government is to really narrow in on how risk is defined. Because a private company can look back on their history and say, we've been providing electricity for 70 years. We know exactly how many squirrels are going to knock out electrical power this year. It's 5. They know it. They've gotten it down, been doing this for 70 years. So they can calculate their anti-squirrel defense into their budget. And they know exactly how much that's going to weigh versus profit and loss. You can't do that with the PRC. So they don't have that information drawn on internally. They have to get it from the government. And so it's absolutely essential that we're able to continually have that conversation back and forth to refine that information so it's actually useful to determine profit and loss. If we can get even close to that kind of understanding of what rodents are going to do to power generation, then I think we're going to have a much stronger private sector response.
Mm-hmm. Greg, if I could actually pick up on that. First of all, I don't anticipate Ron's going to be asked the question, how many squirrels came across the border last year? I hope not. But actually I want to emphasize and pick up on something that he spoke about, and that is the different perspective that the private sector brings on these issues. The extent to which we can integrate those different perspectives really harnesses the national power inside of the United States, because we bring so much to bear. Not only the solutions that are just organic to the intelligence community and the U.S. federal national security community, but the specific insights, be it the number of squirrels, attacking electrical grids in a particular locale. It's by blending that information and doing it in a sustained way that allows us to maintain an advantage over the adversaries, be it those coming across the border, virtually, physically, or otherwise, and then also those that exist inside the United States.
Mm-hmm. So maybe on the theme of coordination and cooperation, Ron, you could talk about the Intel Center and some of the ways you've tried to expand or have expanded cooperation with different parts of the government in your mission.
Yeah, thank you very much, Greg. That's a great opportunity to talk about what we've established out of Tucson, Arizona, what we call a Southern Border Intelligence Center. And our concept there was to create a trans-regional understanding of the border threats all the way from Miami over to San Diego. So we have what we call regional intelligence centers, and we have a regional intelligence center out of San Diego, California that covers California. We've got a regional intelligence center in Arizona. We've got one in in El Paso that covers New Mexico and West Texas. We have a Southern Texas Regional Intelligence Center, and then one in Miami that covers the Caribbean. And then we created this Southern Border Intelligence Center that takes each one of those threat pictures and meshes them together to create a trans-regional understanding. And that was pretty good for Customs and Border Protection. But as we looked at the overwhelming threat of the synthetics coming into our country, and we also looked at the illicit migration threat, we wanted to include a whole of government effort. So right now, we've actually integrated 15 executive branch agencies into that Southern Border Intelligence Center, to include the Department of War. And we've got the Northern Command has set up their Southern Intelligence Task Force, Southern Border Intelligence Task Force, co-located with us. The FBI has taken their Counter-Cartel Coordination Center and embedded that with us as well. And the significance of that and these executive branch agencies coming to us is, with the designation of the drug trafficking organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, that increases the amount of authorities and capabilities that can be brought to bear against them. And so along with the FBI, the NSA, DEA, the Department of War, and a host of other entities, what we're doing now is we're looking at the threat at that plaza level, and we're federating that across the government, and we're determining who has the right placement, access, capability and authorities that can be placed against different aspects of this threat to help us achieve understanding, and then determine how we leverage different authorities and capabilities against it. So for instance, we are looking at how do we create, so we created what we call Plaza Spike, and so Plaza Spike is a campaign where we're trying to cause as much disruption at the plazas as possible. And we divided it into 3 lines of effort. And the first line of effort was to illuminate and expose the plaza. How do we achieve the highest degree of understanding of that plaza? Their command and control, the way that they're doing their logistics, the way that they're doing recruiting, what commodities are they moving, what warehouses do they go through, what trucking companies, what brokerage companies. How do we create the highest degree of understanding that we can at the plaza level? Once we achieve that, then we execute line of effort 2 and 3. Line of effort 2 is what we call non-judicial disruption. How do we go after a brokerage company that is either witting or unwittingly facilitating the flow of drugs into the United States? How do we disrupt the trucking companies? We can sanction them. We can do audits of them. How do we look at those warehouses and things of that nature? How do we revoke visas on family members of cartel members that are moving fentanyl into the United States? And then that third line of effort are the judicial consequence. How do we enable either the government of Mexico or our own law enforcement agencies within the United States to either arrest and deliver that judicial consequence? And it becomes even more significant again with that foreign terrorist organization designation, because if you can prove that an individual is providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization that was formerly a drug trafficking organization, the legal consequence is much, much higher than the drug trafficking charges. And then as we start to then apply that to those entities that are supporting the cartels, we are hoping to isolate them. The cartels will either leverage violence or threat of violence in order to have different entities support them. Can we counterbalance that with material support to terrorism charges to say, well, if you do support that terrorist organization, this is the consequence to you for doing that? And will that then isolate the cartels? Because a cartel, an international or a transnational criminal organization's center of gravity is money. It's not ideology, it's nothing more than money. And so if you take away the means by which they make money, you take away their source of power, and then you can disaggregate them and eventually destroy them as an organization. So that's why we've brought all those different government agencies into a single location. We achieve swivel chair access, so we're not putting an email to someone, we're just turning the chair, we're talking to them, we're asking them, we're creating that understanding. Once the understanding is created, then we do an interagency spectrum of effects to determine who can bring what to bear, and then we start to degrade from there.
Thanks, Ron. I'd like to put this to both Matt and Joe from your own perspectives. AI, how is it helping you? How is it helping your adversaries? Who's winning?
Yeah, so I want to address that by following up on the example that Ron just gave in terms of the cooperation among all the parties involved at the southern border to protect us there. I draw attention to something called Salt Typhoon. Salt Typhoon is a Chinese, long-standing, multi-year now campaign by the part of the Chinese security services to try to gain access to U.S. critical infrastructure, and it's something that's now targeted not only individuals, literally individuals throughout America, individual humans, American citizens, also the private sector, multiple telecommunications companies, as well as state, local, and federal government agencies. So this is a very enduring and ominous threat, and unfortunately a persistent threat that we've been grappling with. It is that type of threat is particularly concerning to us because AI is an enabler for those types of threats, even insofar as we're now concerned about the prospect of generative AI developing cyber tools organically to evolve and continue to threaten U.S. critical infrastructure. And yet, one of the ways we're trying to stay out in front, or one of the things we are doing to stay out in front of that threat, is cooperating with many international governments. So we understand that Salt Typhoon to date has actually targeted 80 different countries in the world, including the United States. And so just late last month, DHS and CISA in particular, our cybersecurity agency, in concert with the FBI and a number of international governments, foreign governments, all collectively collaborated to understand and look to develop mitigation measures to help buy down the risk that Salt Typhoon has brought to our economy and U.S. citizens involved. AI fundamentally is also a tool that the intelligence community is looking to use to first of all, gain a competitive advantage over adversaries. It's not just a matter of AI tools, the actual AI technical solutions, but human ability to effectively leverage those tools. That is something we're investing heavily into, so that it's something that truly gives us a sustained competitive advantage over the adversary. And that's how we're looking to use AI to stay out in front of them.
Yeah, to add to that, I think that AI is absolutely going to speed and spread proliferation of attacks across the private sector. We're already seeing that's a pretty well expanded, but you can have a kitty hacker now who can develop fairly compelling access to most networks. Using AI, that's just going to get faster. We're going to see nation states that are going to be able to develop offensive cyber capabilities that I think in 10 years we'll look back on it and say, wow, they're as good as many nation state actors were originally, right? So I'm not saying that this is going to jump a small nation into the level of the United States or Russia or Israel, but it's going to spread across maybe even not even nation states, just criminal organizations are going to have capabilities we never imagined before. So I think part of the meaning for that is, one is the coordination with the federal government to be able to enable the private sector to use edge defense in AI much more rapidly and to inform those capabilities so that they can be deployed by the private sector more quickly across all of these, what I think are currently vulnerable networks, is going to be essential.
And Joe, if you, just to add to that, make your pitch. I'm a company owner, and you're trying to tell me I face a cyber threat, I face an AI threat, I just see a big expense that I don't want to make, and I don't feel like my industry is particularly vulnerable. Explain the kind of pitch you're making when you talk to us.
So I think currently right now that there is a very strictly a comparison between profit and loss. And so if you have a company that's buying cyber insurance, you have that number as your pen, right? So if you spend $300,000 a year on cyber insurance, then any cyber defense has got to be less than that. There's no reason to continue to pay $300,000 and then spend an extra $1 million on top of that for a defense that may or may not ever work. So the first question is, how can you tangibly connect to profit and loss? I think Colonial is a pretty well-known example.
The pipeline.
The Colonial pipeline that had their financial systems locked down and encrypted and ended up losing millions of dollars.
Again, just to clarify, the pipeline wasn't shut down. The hackers had got into the financials, and then Colonial made the decision to turn off the pipeline.
So in coordination with the U.S. government, they were able to find a path forward where they could pay the ransom and get most of that money back. However, that, I believe, was a one-off. So having pretty good insight into what actually happened there, that is not a replicable model, and it's very likely that other companies in the future are going to have millions of dollars in loss in their financial systems unless they can have more active defense that prevents that activity. I think that there's a very big opening for the federal government to consider what offensive cyber looks like in this space as well, which I don't think that anybody has attempted to fully define, but is a potential opportunity to buy down cost and to raise the risk to criminal actors in that space. but also to provide us with some opportunity for coordination against nation-state actors who wouldn't be focused necessarily on the financial, but on the actual sabotage, the physical destruction of systems, which I think we take for granted, right? So everybody who deals with the data center, which is everybody in the room, uses massive amounts of water. You don't have to break into the IT systems of that data center. You just have to shut down the chillers. And all that equipment is permanently broken after about 24 hours, right? So you can go after, in this area, the Washington Aquifer and break their capability to deliver water to your data center, or you can fight through all the high-speed cyber defenses. Which one do you want to do? One, you can actually replace the software and firmware. The other one, you have to buy all new servers. So that's the sort of decision that I would present to a private company to say, which one would you like to prepare for? The one where you have an absolute catastrophic loss, or the one where you're back up and running in 24 hours?
And please understand, it's not just major nation-state adversaries that are able to deploy AI as a threatening tool.
Absolutely.
Low-level ransomware, cyber attackers, up to the major nation-state adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so forth. But I think one of the points, too, is that this unlocks opportunity for a lot of other nation-state adversaries who could take advantage of that, learn very quickly, indeed even sometimes using AI to develop models for deploying it to their parochial interests.
And so, and let me just pick up on the notion between an intrusion of some sort, ransomware versus sabotage among nation-state actors. You mentioned Salt Typhoon, where the Chinese have, since 2019, have been quietly going through telecoms records for the ones they want and wanted to stay there as long as possible unnoticed, versus perhaps, let's say, North Korea, who faces a threat, they feel, and they want to respond with a sabotage. Could you talk, Matt and Joe, both of you, about this difference about dealing with a state actor who may want to sabotage or who may want to just quietly be infiltrating your system unnoticed? Yeah,
I'll quickly just touch on the fact that I mentioned Salt Typhoon, and that was and is today, continues to be an effort to gain access to conduct cyber espionage, to gather information about targets at the individual level, the corporate level, the public level, in terms of U.S. government structures. An analog to that is Volt Typhoon, if you hadn't heard of it, and that specifically differs insofar as their PRC intelligence and security services are attempting to gain access, but then specifically are pre-positioning capabilities in the event of a conflict that they could bring to bear and sort of tune to the situation at hand to try to minimize the United States' ability to react, namely in the event of a conflict between China and Taiwan. So Volt Typhoon specifically is an effort designed to be able to maintain access and conduct sabotage in the event of a conflict and create a disadvantage for the United States.
To add on to that, I would say that if most cyber operators, when they're gaining access, one, we shouldn't separate cyber off into its own bucket. It's absolutely built in with human beings and other actors. So one insider can provide massive amounts of accelerant for any cyber attack. So we shouldn't consider them one or the other. We should always consider them as a whole. But two, as a cyber intruder is getting into a system, the first thing they have to do is gain access and then map and then probably find other access points in order to run operations. We can't really determine the difference until we see them actually act on it between just collecting information and mapping a network and killing the network. So until they kill it, we don't know that that's what they're there for. So that cyber sabotage is a really cheap sub-nuclear way to have a strategic effect on another nation state. And it's always there. So if we see someone getting into the telecoms infrastructure, it might be to collect information from the telecoms infrastructure. It might also be to break the telecom infrastructure that, say, DoD relies on. We don't really know until it happens because, pretty key point, our sensors and our measurements internally of most networks just suck, just really, really bad. We don't look at it very hard, and we don't look at it from an attacker's point of view. where the attackers are much more fluid. They don't need to have a very heavy footprint. So, and one of the things we talk about is living off the land, which is one of the major issues that I don't think that the PRC or Russia or other actors are living off the land because they have to. I think it's just that easy, that they just use the sysadmin's privileges in order to accelerate and to elevate privileges inside the system, and they go wherever they want because it's just that easy. The logging and internal networks censoring is really poor. So they don't have to send James Bond to do something that just a paperboy could do. So that's what we're seeing right now, partly because we're not challenging them enough inside the network, but two, our information that we're getting off of those isn't great. One of the things I would point out is that Microsoft is the one who named Volt Typhoon because they're the ones who found it, right? So it wasn't the national security establishment, at least on the unclassified level, that found any of that stuff. It was Microsoft, a private company, that found it, which is an indication of where we are for how we find things and how capable we are broadly.
Got a good question from the audience here, and it's for Matt. Others should feel free to jump in. What is the threat today from ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations? And I'll add just a bit of my own. We talked about the lone individual, and today, given advances in technology and surveillance, isn't it much harder to be a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, be a network and go undetected versus a lone actor who obviously has much less the inability to carry out ongoing attacks, but is much more likely to go undetected?
Yeah, briefly what I would say is, Ron talked about transnational criminal organizations, transnational across international borders. International terrorism today certainly continues to be something we're very concerned about and we monitor very closely. ISIS and other international terrorist organizations certainly consistently try to evolve, and yet I will say that it's something that we have had, I think, generally some good success inside the United States in terms of defending against it. It's yet again something that we want to work very closely with our international partners to help maintain resilience to it out beyond America's borders, so that we don't see spikes or specific threats inside the homeland. And yet again, with the transnational criminal organization model that Ron spoke to, unfortunately, social media is another venue in which international terrorist organizations can inspire lone offenders and can reach them. We see that as an accelerant for their goals, and something that we try to understand appropriately within the U.S. homeland because of First Amendment protected speech and the use of social media. But certainly, it also provides a venue for them to be able to radicalize individuals, and so that's something we're always concerned about and trying to deal with appropriately.
So, Ron, you mentioned, well, let me put it this way. You can quantify very precisely how many border encounters you have every month with individuals who may be trying to get into this country. Can you do the same thing? Can you quantify with the drug smuggling? Is that down dramatically as well? Let me just raise one thing that popped into my mind. We know that the number of people trying to come across the border is way down. Yep. The number of drug overdose deaths related to fentanyl has also been coming down sharply. Is there a correlation there?
So I think it's very dangerous to say there's a correlation there, because correlation doesn't always equal causation, and there are too many factors outside that bear on that, such as the increased public awareness of how to address an overdose, the distribution of
Narcan.
There, thank you, Narcan.
Narcan.
And so in order to honestly say that you understand the impact that you're having, you'd have to understand how much is coming in. And we don't understand how much is coming in. So if you don't truly understand how much is coming in, you really don't know how much you're stopping. And so this is I'll use this example. There were 90 tons of methamphetamine seized south of where was it? It was in Reynosa. So just across the border, 90 tons. So we looked at, all right, 90 tons have been taken out of circulation. What effect did that have on the street price of meth? 0. So if you can pull 90 tons out and not have any effect, how much is coming into the United States? And meth is still the #1 drug coming into the United States. So it's hard to say you're able to measure an impact. You can look at the number of seizures that are going up, but again, if you don't know what the denominator was, you don't really know how successful you're being. And the overdose deaths, that's a very, very positive trend to see. But that can't be the single determining factor of whether or not you're being successful because of all the factors that affect an overdose. And so the answer to your question is no.
Yeah. So, and then this leads into a question from an audience member. What are your key technology challenges at the border? Is there anything specifically to the drug smuggling component here, technology that would help? And then more broadly, any other technologies that are you're working on?
So the technology that's used at the border are non-intrusive inspection devices. Those are x-rays of vehicles because obviously when you want to move drugs, you want to move them in large quantities. And so 18-wheel tractor trailers and things of that nature. How do you detect the deep concealments within vehicles? So non-intrusive inspection, how do you get more detailed imagery, and how do you go through that more rapidly? Also, how do you listen to the enemy in the most effective means possible, and then take all of the collection that you have and turn it into making sense? So that's an application of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And so you're looking at those types of technology. And a lot of this is dependent upon how when it comes to countering terrorists coming in between the ports of entry, which would be an illegal entry, we're really reliant on the other executive branch agencies to put the derogatory information into common databases so that when we encounter an individual, that information is readily available and we can assess that person. So the speed with which you can get information into a large data system and then have that alert to you when you know you've encountered that person.
Greg, if I could just pick up on one point there too, and I think it draws back to the question about ISIS. A lot of this does come down to, and Ron mentioned derogatory information, a lot of this comes down to what are indicators of threats. And a lot of this information sharing between national security stakeholders dealing with all of these issues comes down to understanding how do we define the evolving threats over time? What are the indicators that we can say with a level of confidence directly relate to those threats? And then it's a matter of getting that information out to those who can do something about it. Not only recognize what they are as a threat as early as possible, and preferably with our partners before they get access to the United States, but then also as well inside the United States, if the extent to which we can share those quickly with law enforcement and first responders on the ground throughout the community.
And Greg, just one last piece on the technology. Really, it's your ability to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to rapidly make sense of large amounts of data that you are collecting, and then being able to identify an anomaly, whether that's in an air domain, a sea domain, a cyber domain, or potentially a subterranean domain as well. Because we've got so much data, and it's your ability to identify the anomaly and the threat within that data that then enables action.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thanks. Joe, you had a long career in the intelligence community before you joined Parsons and moved to the private sector. Talk about what it looked like from the inside, the FBI and other places you may have worked, versus what it looks like in your current position, things you can do or can't do, or just what your perspective is.
I think that the biggest difference was the cultural barriers inside the government sort of stated outcomes, even the budget cycle, were all things that you just sort of learned and internalized that were in many cases irrelevant to the private sector entirely. And we didn't see that when we were inside the Bureau. We were too busy talking about how to get information out or waiting for the next fiscal year and not realizing we're missing entire generations of technology for the budget issue, but also that just getting each other to work together. So law enforcement and intelligence, very, very different than the regulatory agencies, and they have very different goals and ways of interacting with the private sector. One of the reasons why Colonial went the way that they did, for instance, is they didn't want to have regulators inside of their network. And they absolutely don't want to have groups that are going to cost them money trying to, quote unquote, solve their problems, right? So I'm from the government, I'm here to help is the first thing they think. And having a very different perspective on how do you cross that trust divide with the private sector so that they realize that you are on their side and what you're providing is tangible and they can actually make a decision. So I think a lot of us know, from the military or the intelligence world, you have to provide a decision-making advantage. The way you make the decision and what kinds of decisions are absolutely critical. In the private sector, it's much more about where am I going to mitigate my losses and how am I going to increase my profits. And that's the way that risk has to be translated, I think, more effectively. Regulation is not it. Because if they see that as one of the first things they have to deal with, at least most of the companies that I've dealt with, they step right away from anything you have to say and don't even want you to help.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Matt, a question from the audience directed to you. Really good questions, folks. I should have had you write all my questions as well. Discuss DHS efforts to curtail China's investment in American farmland, especially near military bases and critical infrastructure. And I'll expand that to even any other Chinese, the sort of quiet, creeping Chinese threats that are not big headline-grabbing events. But we can start with the farmland.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks for the question. First and foremost, I would say, for those who are not aware, there's an entity called the Council on Foreign Investment in the United States. That's a government organization. It's really a consortium of U.S. government agencies, including the intelligence community, who have insights that they can deliver to inform decisions about what could be predatory investment inside the United States. And it's an important concept to understand insofar as, one of the bedrocks of American security is a healthy economy. And this gets back to the point that was just being made by Joe about that interplay between national security and economic security for economic gains. And yet, at the same time, we do want to work as early as possible in that investment process to identify those things that might have a mid or long-term or otherwise unforeseen risk to national security that would undermine the very foundation of our economy at a strategic national level. So the Council on Foreign Investment in the United States is the earliest possible entity within the U.S. government that can identify those issues and drive decisions and conversations between the public and private sector about how we should think about this investment. Is it actually good, or what risk might it actually bring to the United States long term? So that's the primary vehicle we use to be able to make those decisions early on when it comes to foreign investment inside the United States. I'll also say that within that process, and increasingly through collaboration across the intelligence community, which again, I'd remind folks who have never worked in the intelligence community, prior to just a couple of decades ago, we didn't really have the term intelligence community. There were intelligence agencies. The modern era is the modern trend, and it's one that's not going to change anytime soon, is that it truly is a community. It's one that spends a lot of effort to be able to share that intelligence and make those decisions based on evolving threats over time. So even if CFIUS, the council I spoke to earlier, even if that doesn't necessarily identify early on and effectively a particular threat, first and foremost because of the attempts by our adversaries to obscure the threatening nature of those investments. Those are things that we can address through shared, persistent information sharing across our national security structures, and again with the private sector. And a lot of that does happen within the Department of Homeland Security, namely my office and CISA, as well as other members of the intelligence community and our partners in the intelligence community, to be able to provide that direct outreach, and the Bureau as well, because it's as much, the prospect is as much one of criminality as it is national security issues. And that's really where we talk about the issue of counterintelligence, the extent to which a foreign government is trying to gain access using their foreign intelligence services to conduct a variety of threats, be it espionage, cyber and otherwise that we discussed, as well as other prospective threats, sabotage, and other manifestations of foreign intelligence services.
And this question, Matt, was sort of a follow-up, but any of you can jump in on this. The original question referred to the Chinese buying farmland in perhaps sensitive areas. But this takes place in other areas as well. I'm thinking Silicon Valley, and I'm thinking I've heard stories where a couple bright young guys are making an advance in quantum, and they've got a little startup, and somebody's offering them a huge sum of money, and they say, great, we're going to get rich. And then CFIUS or somebody will step in and say, that's Chinese money coming to you indirectly, and the Chinese want to be an investor to steal your technology, and you're not going to get rich because you're not going to sell it to them. Can any of you maybe address this, both also in the technology sphere?
I think this resolves back to articulation of risk. So if is farmland or quantum, either one. If there's a huge plot of land that's being bought by the PRC and it's right outside of Stratcom or whatever area, the local government often wants that sale. They want that large company to come in. They want that revenue coming into the state. And so there is a counter pressure from the political environment that goes directly against CFIUS, right? So even if it did get to CFIUS, which is not universal, then they're presented with a really tough decision between a local government and sometimes companies that are pushing very hard in the administration, and this has gone on for several administrations, where they say proximity does not equate threat. So until you come up with a smoking gun, we will not consider this an issue. Now that goes back and forth depending on the type of technology and the type of purchase and the administration. But that sort of thing has to be confronted with an articulation of risk to the stakeholders. So you have to go out and explain to that governor in some cases, this is exactly why this is a bad thing, because you are inviting one, you may not have known what was going on at Stratcom. You might be fully aware of how sensitive that is. But two, these people have a direct relationship to 3PLA or something potentially. And so to your point, Matt, you really do have to do all that legwork over and over again to articulate risk, the way that that audience is going to take it, so that they understand I'm not just getting a bunch of revenue right before an election in my home state. I am inviting a destabilizing factor for a DoD, which has been a huge customer and stabilizing force in this community for generations. And that has to be brought to bear really clearly. The commander and that part of the military, the security services inside the country, DHS, FBI, all of them have to have a clear communication path, both to the private sector and the local government, because all these different levels have very different goals. So it can't just come in with CFIUS and hammer everybody.
And a key point there, and maybe a myth, is that the intelligence community does not just exist inside Washington, D.C., within 20 miles or so of where we're sitting right now. There are intelligence officers and connections between the intelligence community and state and local governments across the United States and its territories as well. We were talking before the discussion here today about Guam, Puerto Rico, Alaska. These are parts of the homeland that are out on the periphery. They're out on the sort of the edge of America's soil, and they are facing enduring threats as well. Even there, we're able to extend the information and capabilities of the intelligence community to help protect a blanket of security for them where they need it. And the threats are just as multifaceted and just as dynamic there as they are in farmlands within Kansas and the Dakotas and so forth. And to that question, just to pick up on one point, we just saw a few months ago, there were arrests made with respect to the prospective bioterrorist threat inside the homeland. So when we talk about farmland, it's not just from an intelligence collection standpoint, it's an economic security issue. If they can gain access to technology that benefits the agro, business within our competitors, that's something we want to protect. It's something we should be proud of and preserve inside the integrity of it inside the United States. On the same token, they also can use it as a platform for other activities, and as long as you own it, it's something you can use over time. So the extent to which we can make those deliberate decisions with folks on the ground, it's absolutely in our interest, and it's something we put a lot of effort towards.
Ron, a couple of questions for you. You mentioned increased cooperation among U.S. government agencies. What about the Mexicans, which is the nature of this question, collaboration with the Mexican government, but also perhaps other countries south of the border as well?
Yeah, so I would characterize for Customs and Border Protection, the cooperation with the government of Mexico is very high. So the government of Mexico recognizes the synthetic threat. They also recognize the threat that they don't ever want to have a terrorist transit through Mexico come into the United States and conduct an act. So we share information with them, and they are very receptive to that information, and then when appropriate, they action it. And so, again, for us, that's very strong. As you move through Central and South America, what we're seeing is a very strong push on the part of China and Russia to have a much stronger influence in Central and South America, particularly in Colombia. And so we have to be very careful on how we share information with these countries because of the potential for them to use Chinese technology and introduce that into their countries, and then how does that put our information in jeopardy in an insecure environment. So we are looking at that and we're evaluating that as we move forward. Panama has been very cooperative. We've had, like I said, good relationships with the government of Mexico, and we're working, I think, closely right now with Guatemala as well. But then as you start to move farther south, you just run into a huge China and Russia attempt to expand their influence.
Sort of a related note there. With all these agencies and partners working together at the Southern Border Intel Center, are you sharing any of this information on the unclassified side that might be relevant to businesses, companies, individuals?
So for the answer is yes. As we discover information that is going to result in a law enforcement finish of some kind, yes. As we look to find companies or entities that are wittingly supporting the cartels, we're looking to make sure that we can optimize that effect as much as possible as well. So whether that results in the sanction or an audit or the taking away of a privilege, such as this program called CTPAT, which gives certain trucking companies and companies favorable status to come into the United States, removing things of that nature. That's all those things can be publicly available.
Got it. I think we're down to our last question here. And I'll throw this to all of you, but Joe, I think you mentioned this in one of our discussions prior to the panel. You said DC moves at the speed of meetings. How do you change that and make it move at the speed of AI? And so the question to you and to all of you is, what do you want to see move faster?
I think that there are a lot of overlapping authorities for different scenarios. And for one, if there's a natural disaster versus a national security issue, it is difficult to determine who is the primary agency to take action. And that resolves itself tactically on the ground very often. So if you have great relationships in the field, great, then folks will work together as one team. But often that's not the case. And it also means your goals, the outcomes you're trying to get are different. So if it is a national security issue or a military issue, then folks like Northcom might try and step up and say we should be in charge here. but they don't have all the capability, and they're trying to pull that from other groups. If it is a truly national emergency like a flooding environment, and FEMA would have the lead, they have to borrow all their planes from DoD. And so aligning those authorities in DC would be extraordinarily useful in making sure that was clear down at the tactical level.
Got it. Matt?
Yeah, I think in terms of the fundamental question here about what would you like to see faster, I do think progress towards the public-private sector partnership on these issues. I think AI and other solutions and just learning and knowledge sharing between all the different stakeholders. We have higher fidelity understanding of a lot of these threats, but because they are evolving, it truly requires an integrated solution, especially at the nexus of the public and the private sector and all the different solutions we can bring to bear together. So I think, again, we're very proud to be able to deliver insights that are widely usable, not only in DHS Office of Intelligence Analysis, but a number of our IC partners, FBI and others, to be able to get out those insights, but then to use them across different domains. Again, this public-private sector partnership, but then across those who can actually take action to do something about these threats because they're so evolving and multifaceted today. Speed.
Ron, get the last word.
All right, thanks. That's really cool. All right. So from Customs and Border Protection, what we would like to see is the speed with authorities that are required to enable action are given at a much faster rate, because those authorities will enable you to develop understanding, and then that understanding will then lead to action, and then that action leads to strengthening your border security.
Excellent. I'd like to thank everybody on the panel today and to INSA for putting on such a great program. A big round of applause, please, for everybody on the panel.
Round of applause for everyone. And you're now on break for lunch until 1 o'clock, and you'll be back for breakout sessions. Again, how about another round of applause? This has been such a great discussion this morning. Thank you so much.